So, hello and welcome to the History of Military Engineering. Today we'll be covering the period from 2000 BC to 400 BC. At the end of the last lecture we saw that the first combat vehicle that we observed on planet Earth is a war wagon that has a number of donkeys carrying it forward, solid wooden wheels, and a driver and a warrior with some javelins. However, these war wagons didn't really have particularly good mobility. They could carry a heavy load, they could take you fairly far, but they couldn't give you a lot of speed because the wheels were not at all optimized for high-speed travel, and so therefore these weren't particularly useful for charging at the enemy or for high-speed attacks or other such ventures. We see the evidence for the first spoke wheels, so significantly lighter construction, with the Sintashta culture from the Ural Mountains, developed first around 2000 BC. And with the Sintashta culture, we observed that their chariots are primarily found buried in a number of burials, so presumably the burials of kings or local chiefs. With the Sintashta, we unfortunately do not find their wheels themselves because the wheels have long become decayed and rotten away. However, in their burials, we do find imprints from the wheels that show very clearly that these had spokes on them, and even the structure of some of those spokes. So, from the Sintashta culture, we see the first evidence for chariots that were actually dedicated and designed to have high-speed mobility. Because with a spoke, the wheel is much lighter, but also remains strong, and therefore it's able to take you at much higher speeds. After the initial development of the spoke wheel chariot by the Sintashta around 2000 BC, we see proliferation of the spoke wheel chariot throughout the Old World. By 1800, the spoke wheel chariot reached the Central Asian steppes and northern Persia. Around 1600, it first made its foray into China, into India, into Anatolia, and then further on into Egypt and Greece, and towards 1000 to 500 BC, the rest of Western Europe as well. Probably the most historically important introduction of chariots to any particular culture was the introduction of chariots to the Egyptians by the Hyksos, by means of the Hyksos invasion of Egypt. Around 1650 BC, the Hyksos people, who are believed to have come from Canaan, or at least related to Canaanites, invaded most of Egypt and held control over most of Egypt for a solid century, with the entirety of the Egyptian people subservient to the Hyksos. And with their invasion, they introduced a lot of new technologies that the Egyptians didn't really see or have experience with before. Primarily, this included horses. The Egyptians had never seen a horse before in their lives. The chariot, which was pulled by these said horses. They introduced the composite bow. They introduced new arrowheads, improved bronze working techniques, and stronger swords. So when the Hyksos invasion came, the ancient Egyptian empire and the army basically didn't really have any reasonable degree of defense against the invasion whatsoever. Around a few centuries later, we also begin to see the dawn of standardized horsemanship. Around 1350 BC, a certain Kekuli, who was described as master horse trainer from the land Mitanni, wrote a text about horse training, the first text on horse training that we know ever existed in history. This was eventually adopted by the Hittite chariot corps, and in fact the Mitanni nation was one of the nations that was absorbed by the Hittites. So what we observe is, with this text, there are the first instructions on the breeding of horses, the raising of horses. Earlier, people mostly just captured horses and then bred them in captivity however they could, but this was the first set of instructions on explicitly how to manage your horses if you want to have better horses for your actual chariot army. We also see the introduction, thanks to the Hyksos, of the composite bow. Earlier, or simple bows were made out of just a single piece of wood, which was then bent and released to fire the bow. What we see with the composite bow is that it's built from multiple materials. You still use wood as the primary base for the bow, but you now apply a thin layer of animal horn on the inside, so the side that's facing the archer, and this horn is then able to store more energy in compression when you compress the bow, and on the outside of the bow, which faces towards the enemy, you'll glue together several layers of sinew, and sinew is able to store more energy in tension. Now all of a sudden, for the exact same size of the bow, you have a lot more energy that it can store, therefore you can fire an arrow with significantly greater speed and greater kinetic energy. The advantage is that the composite bow, because it's more strong, it can be made smaller, and since it can be made smaller, it's easier to manage. So if you are an archer on a chariot or on horseback, it's not very convenient to be managing a 1 meter or 1.5 meter bow, but if your bow is only 50 centimeters, but it still gives you all the power that you need to impact the enemy, then you're going to be significantly at a significant advantage over a horseman or a charioteer who doesn't have a composite bow. Another advantage is that the bow itself is in general stronger, so it will give you more more reliability over time as compared to just a simple wooden bow. One of the disadvantages is that a composite bow requires, unfortunately, very long production times. Several months are required for this bow to dry, all of the glue for the sinew and for the horn, and the construction itself is much more complicated and therefore requires more skills. Also, the glue is sensitive to water, so if you have an army traveling through a wet environment or just through rain, the composite bow can easily get damaged, and because it takes so long for all of the components to cure and be prepared, you're not going to be able to just make yourself another composite bow right there in the field, or you're probably not going to be able to just take and fix it right off the bat. So it has a certain number of disadvantages. However, in general, the advantages offset the disadvantages, so it supplanted the simple wooden bow as the weapon of choice for pretty much every army that encountered the composite bow and learned the secret of making it. The origin of the composite bow likely came from the steppe nomads from Central Asia. This is possibly, they might have possibly taken it from northern Asian laminated bows. These were made out of just gluing multiple types of wood, where you got the same type of effect but to a lesser degree. And it's possible that the early composite bows might have been used around the Ural Mountains by 1800 BC, so people who are different cultures like the Santashta culture that we mentioned earlier might have been among the first users of composite bows. Another major new development in the world of the military is the galley. So early Mediterranean ships carried collapsible bipod masts to distribute the load. This was primarily because the hulls were relatively weak. These were built out of a series of planks put together with minimal internal ribbing for reinforcement. So such a ship would not be able to take the load of just a single main mast holding the sail up and holding all of the force of the wind against the sail. But by 2000 BC, we do begin to see the Egyptians are building ships with a single main mast, so that indicates that the structure of the ship is becoming stronger. By 1500 BC, we actually see the Egyptians building seaworthy galleys instead of just riverworthy galleys. In this illustration, you see Queen Hatshepsut's expedition to the land of Punt. This would possibly have gone down using the path of the Red Sea around 1450 BC. And here we see a number of ships which were outfitted for sea conditions rather than just little paddling down the Nile River. And this indicates the high level of shipbuilding that was present in Egypt at the time. The trade expedition was primarily to a trade force for things like spices and perfume and other fairly expensive tools and luxuries of the wealthy. Similar ships would have been used by the Navy to carry Egyptian soldiers, but these would primarily have served as transports. Over here you see a replica of one of Queen Hatshepsut's ships built a few years ago for an experimental archaeological documentary. They showed that it is in fact very seaworthy, but it isn't really developed to be a fighting ship. This is at best just a transport for soldiers to get from point A to point B, and if any warfare would happen on the sea using the ship, then it would basically be just the ship is used as a platform for soldiers to fight each other on foot. Now that we know a little bit about the development of early seagoing ships, we can understand the importance of the Minoan civilization. The Minoan civilization was or at least is considered by some historians to be the first major thalassocracy, or sea power. It was based on the island of Crete, and it depended on a very powerful navy. In fact, its navy was so powerful that most of its cities appear to have been built completely without walls, at a time when pretty much every major city was built with walls for protection. So therefore its navy would have been used to support its trade networks that it had with pretty much every major power in the Mediterranean. It would have been used for border defense and possibly offensive operations against enemy cultures. The primary type of ship that was used by the Minoans was a single bank or galley. Therefore, that just means that along a side of the ship you have a single continuous bank of oars that would have also been powered by square sails. The total ship would have been around 35 meters long, 6 meters of beam, and 25 oars approximately per side. There was only one deck on here where both the rowers and other crew, so that might include soldiers, it might include traders, it might include just random people being transported for a voyage from point A to point B. These would have all shared the exact same deck on this ship. And the same ship would have likely been used for both trade and war, where if outfitted for war, then the ship would have carried a crew of soldiers in addition to the rowers, and if outfitted for trade, just a crew of people trading things and some of their goods instead of the soldiers. And in war, this would have been used to compete against empires. So other empires at the time also had navies which were smaller but still present. So in order to protect your interest against those empires encroaching upon them, these ships would have gone into naval expeditions. Defense against piracy, both for the trade ships and for major cities and colonies that the Minoan Empire had, because pirates, even at that time, were already a fairly significant threat. The Minoan civilization also had some of the finest infantry equipment of the time. They had bronze swords that could be in excess of 100 centimeters in length, while many other cultures had swords which were shorter, perhaps 60 to 80 centimeters. This was because the Minoans had better bronze working techniques than a lot of their neighboring cultures. They had better shields. These were larger and protected a significantly greater portion of the person. These had primarily a wood construction with some hide on the outside for extra defense, and possibly a thin overlay of bronze on the very outside, but it would not have been a metal shield. It would have only used the metal perhaps to deter flaming arrows. And the Minoan civilization was doing really, really well up until the Minoan eruption, around 1630 BC, as you can see illustrated here. The Minoan eruption was one of the most devastating eruptions in recorded history, and probably the worst eruption that was witnessed and borne through by any people in recorded history in general. The eruption was of this island of Santorini. The island used to be one whole solid piece until the entire middle of it basically blew up in the eruption, and the central mountain sank into the caldera that was formed as a result of that eruption. It's estimated that the eruption would have released around 60 cubic kilometers of ejecta. For comparison, Mount St. Helens released just 4.2 cubic kilometers. So essentially, Mount St. Helens, but multiplied by a factor of 15, is what the Minoan eruption and what the Minoans would have experienced. The eruption obviously annihilated Santorini Island. We just saw Santorini Island right there. And that was very unfortunate because on Santorini Island, the Minoans had one of their major naval bases called Akrotiri, and that naval base was no more as of that eruption. The ash plume rose to a height of as high as 35 kilometers. It generated tsunami, so both the eruption itself and then the major collapse of the dome as the caldera that used to be full of lava is emptied, the dome would collapse into the empty void, and the resultant tsunami could have reached as high as 150 meters according to oceanographic simulations. So by the time it would have hit North Crete, it would have been significantly lower at 35 meters, but that's still much higher than anything that you need to destroy a port city, especially a port city of something as simple as 1630 BC. And presumably because the majority of the Minoan Empire was up to the north, their major naval ports and naval bases would have been on the northern coast of Crete, along with the island of Santorini. So pretty much every single major naval base, except for anything they would have had on the south of Crete, was annihilated as a result of this eruption, and the Minoans would have basically been left defenseless and pretty much without a navy. The island of Akrotiri, in addition to, the town of Akrotiri, in addition to being partially obliterated by the eruption itself, was then covered by 7 meters of ash. So over here you see digs on of the city. The ash was initially higher than these walls. So for somebody coming into the island before these digs, it would have been just a covering of dirt by now. But in fact, we still see that a large portion of the city still survived being buried. Here we can see a painting that was on the inside of one of these buildings that's believed to represent the port of Akrotiri at its heyday, with many ships coming and going. So the loss of Akrotiri and the loss of those northern Cretan naval bases would have been a significant disaster to the Minoans. The legacy of this eruption is believed to have been recorded in a number of ways. The legend of Atlantis is possibly inspired by the Minoan eruption and the destruction of Akrotiri and basically the Minoan fleet in one go. It is believed to have been the inspiration for the Titanomachy. That was the battle between the Olympian deities and the Titans that's described in ancient Greek mythology. And it's believed that this eruption is also recorded in the Chinese bamboo annals. So the bamboo annals were written many centuries after the events they initially described. But when they described the legendary Shah dynasty, which fell around 1618 BC, the collapse is associated with a yellow fog, a dim sun, 3 suns crossing July famine, and the withering of all 5 cereals. This would have been very similar to the effects you would expect from such a massive eruption, as all of that ash goes into the upper atmosphere and gets distributed all over the world. It begins to block out the sun. The temperatures across the globe begin to drop, and similar effects as those described in the annals would be expected. With the fall of the Minoans, their primary competitor, the Mycenaeans, basically had a free card to take over the Aegean, and so they did. The Mycenaeans were a very, very warlike people. From them we have the first evidence of full-body plate armor. This is the Dendra panoply and a reconstruction of the Dendra panoply. The body armor worn by the Mycenaeans would have consisted of a body cuirass, some shoulder guards, skirt plates protecting the body down to the knee, as well as neck plates protecting the neck. The Mycenaeans also wore helmets. Their helmets were usually conical and made out of leather and lined with boar tusks. And we're not entirely sure why boar tusks, probably more for decorative purposes than for functional, but that's what they did. And they did have some helmets made with bronze, but those were generally more rare. It was typically the leather and the boar tusk helmet that they used. They also had new shields that were in a figure 8. These would have been a little bit stiffer, but also built out of wood and hide, and possibly using a little bit of reinforcement as well. One of the major developments that the Mycenaeans had was their sword. Their swords reached a length of 1.3 meters and a width across the blade of around 3 centimeters. This was even longer than the Minoan swords, so it shows that they had better bronze working techniques still, eventually. And they also came up with another type of sword intended for close combat. These were significantly shorter at just 65 centimeters. And eventually their short swords evolved into something called the Naue II sword, which was very widely used in Greece for the next few centuries, and even almost up into the Hoplite era. The Mycenaeans were also the first Greeks to adopt the chariot. Their chariots came from the east, so basically eventually as it made its way from the Urals and the Santashta culture, they would have been borrowed most likely from Anatolia. The chariots used by the Mycenaeans would have been driven by 2 horses, and the soldier would have most likely used a spear as his primary weapon, and the driver would have been just the driver. It's unlikely or it is likely that they might have used archers, but there's no evidence of using archers with chariots. by the Messenians in either writing or in art, so it's not necessarily, we cannot necessarily say that they would have used archers. In addition to their land army, the Mycenaeans developed eventually a fairly powerful navy as well. Their ships were generally similar to the Minoan ships, but they were a little bit shallower and built lighter and faster. So this gave them significant or somewhat better speed at sea, but also less durability in case of combat. And these would have carried also around 40 to 50 rowers and some amount of soldiers on deck as well. These also, just like the Minoans, had just a single deck, so the rowers and whoever else was on deck were not separated from each other. And in fact, these ships were so light that they were actually intended to be brought onto the beach between voyages. So the primary use of such a ship would be to get a group of people from some point to some other point and then be brought onto the beach. And there were several reasons for this. The most important one is that if the ship was left in the water for a terribly extended period of time, it would become waterlogged and the wood would swell and the ship would just become too heavy and too lumbering and not nearly as fast and maneuverable as one would like it to be. Also, if left in the wood, it's possible that the ship structure would have itself begun to deteriorate and the ship would sink. So these were really only ferry voyage ships, not intended for extended voyages over the course of like several days or definitely not several months. For a small aside about iron, before we begin talking about the first culture that was able to smelt its own iron, we have evidence that iron of some form or other was used significantly before the conventional Iron Age began. This is an example of some iron meats from Egypt, dated to around 3200 BC. Also an example of an iron dagger from Turkey, dated to around 2500 BC. And these and other artifacts, unlike most iron that we produce today, have a very high amount of nickel that is indicated in the iron. In fact, the nickel for these is estimated to be around 5 to 25% by mass, depending on the specific artifact. And this is much, much higher than most modern iron has, or most iron that you would get from ores in general. This is an example of a scanning electron microscope energy dispersive spectrogram. This is a method to identify the elements that are in some particular component and also identify the relative abundance of those elements. And it's through these studies that we're able to look at these artifacts and identify what's the ratio of the elements that show up in the device. So the origin of this iron was actually not from iron ore or from naturally occurring iron ingots. It was actually meteorites, where if you have a piece of ore from the ground, you have to smelt it, you have to basically separate the iron from the mineral, you have to melt the rock, you have to melt everything at a very, very high temperature in order to get your iron purified out of the process. But with a meteorite, it's already practically a pure metal that comes out of the sky. So it's likely that early people, when they already having discovered some bronze working, when they discovered these new pieces of this really unusual metal, they decided to see what they can do with that, and we have therefore some meteoritic iron being used centuries and thousands, in fact millennia, before iron smelting was discovered and developed. In fact, low production of meteoritic iron artifacts continued even after smelting became fairly widespread. This is an example of Ferro-Tutankhamun's meteoritic dagger dated to 1350 BC. We know that this one is also most likely meteoritic iron because of the high amount of nickel that is found in the iron of the dagger, and the fact that the Egyptians at the time would definitely not have had any reason to put any nickel into their iron because they didn't even know how to do so in the first place. So iron from meteorites was used occasionally in small amounts by various cultures. The first people who actually learned to smelt iron out of ore were the Hittites. And the oldest artifacts from the Hittites that are indicative of smelted iron are dated to around 1800 BC. These are, in fact, relatively carbon-rich compared to most other, or compared to some other ancient artifacts. So some researchers have considered this to perhaps be even a prototype steel but in reality it's probably just the fact that the Hittites didn't have very good control over the amount of coke that they put in to their smelting process. And initially, these iron artifacts were primarily minor little trinkets, decorative beads, and so on and so forth, used by the elites of the Hittite Empire. And by 1500 BC, we see the first iron-based weapons, but these were probably ceremonial or status symbols, because the majority of the weapons made at the time in the Hittite Empire were still made out of bronze, and probably these might have been swords for the king and the commander, but these were not swords for the entire army. With the Hittite Empire, we have a number of military improvements that they had as well. We have the first iron daggers, swords, and spearheads. We also have iron farming tools, which means that all of a sudden you have more available farmland, because a bronze plow is not going to be able to go through quite as difficult of a terrain as an iron plow. And if you have more available farmland, it means you have more available food. If you have more available food, it means you can have a larger army, which is supported by, they said, more available food. So what are the main improvements that they had? The first one is the chariot. Their chariots were significantly heavier than the Mycenaean types, or even the Egyptian types. These had a crew of 3 soldiers, and generally pulled by 2 or 3 horses, of which 1 was the driver and 2 were fighters, so presumably some combination of people with javelins, people with bows and arrows, or both. With the Hittites, and with the emergence of the Egyptian Empire and its expansion, we also get into the first battles. So the first recorded battle of any sort, where there's relatively accurate detail instead of this king went to this city and took it, is the Battle of Megiddo from 1460 BC. This particular battle happened in modern-day Levant, and it was the first time that anybody reported statistics on casualties or POWs, and the first time that people used the compound bow in battle as well. In this battle, Pharaoh Thutmose III attacked the joint Canaanite forces at the city of Megiddo, and he ended up splitting their army in half by going through a pass that they did not expect him to go through, and forced their withdrawal into the city and then besieged it until they surrendered because they ran out of food and supplies. The statistics that were given for the end of the battle was that Egypt took 340 prisoners, but then 2,000 horses, 900 chariots, 1,900 cattle, and 22,000 sheep. So primarily this was a battle that came down to a cattle raid, rather than just killing a bunch of people. Also, 119 Canaanite cities said that they're now subservient to Egypt, so that was a little bit of a plus as well. And the compound bow was used by the Egyptians in this case, so after they adopted it from the Hyksos, this was their use of going back to Canaan and then repaying the favor, basically. We also get to the Battle of Kadesh in 1274 BC. This was the oldest battle on which we have information about tactics and certain troop formations. Also, this was possibly the largest battle because up to 5,000 chariots might have been participating. This was fought between the Egyptians and the Hittites. So in the illustration here, you see the heavier Hittite chariots and the lighter Egyptian chariots going up against each other. In this particular battle, Pharaoh Ramses II, who was the greatest pharaoh that Egypt had according to most historians, decided to lead an army to take the city of Kadesh, which was at the time a disputed territory between the Egyptians and the Hittites, as the Hittites spread south and the Egyptians spread north. He had 4 regular army divisions named after Egyptian deities, and 1 irregular division which is called the Nearin, and the total number of men came down to around 16,000 infantry and probably 2,000 chariots. The Hittites were led by King Mu'tali. He led about 20 nations, where nation really means city-state, so more like 20 cities. And together he had probably around 20,000 infantry and around 3,000 chariots. And over the course of the battle, it really wasn't quite as glamorous as anybody expected it to be, because as the Egyptians were marching to the camp that they planned to use to besiege Kadesh, the Hittites attacked and completely destroyed one of his divisions. Then the Hittites that attacked went in and attacked his camp, which had only 1 of the 4 divisions already in it. And they started pillaging and almost killed Ramses II himself. At the time, while the Hittites were pillaging, they kind of forgot about the fact that the Egyptian soldiers were still there. So the Egyptian soldiers, which were still in the camp that they were supposed to kill, started killing them. And while the Hittites were pillaging, they didn't really realize that they needed to defend themselves. So they got routed, and things got even more interesting when the Nearin division finally came up and then routed the Hittites even more. and the Hittites tried to escape back across the river, and a bunch of them drowned. So everybody probably expected to have this gigantic clash, and it really came down to a comedy of errors. But at the end of the day, both Ramses and Muwatalli decided, okay, maybe we should stop the killing, and signed a peace treaty, which incidentally gets us to the oldest peace treaty in history. In 1259, they signed a treaty between the Hittite Empire and the Egyptian Empire, and not only is it the oldest peace treaty that we know of, it's also the oldest one for which both copies survive. This is the Egyptian copy, this is the Hittite copy. And this basically said that they are drawing their border at that particular section, and then they will not invade each other's territory, and therefore they can focus on fighting other wars and instead of fighting each other. For naval progress, with the Egyptian Empire, we have the first ships that were dedicated to use for war rather than just transports for soldiers. These would have been built more sturdily than just regular transports. These would have also had defensive boards for rowers so that people with bows and arrows and javelins couldn't just take out the rowers in one go. And there was, on the depictions, there is a ram in the shape of an animal head. There's some debate as to whether this was decorative, but if it was in fact intended for military purpose, this might be the first ships that had a ram on them that were intended to ram into another ship and destroy it by basically breaking the side. The Egyptians' other main enemy at the time were this really bizarre group of people called the Sea Peoples. They were referred to by pretty much every single major empire at the time, and nobody knew who the heck they were, except that these were pirates who came out onto shore, terrorized everybody, and then just went back to the sea. Theories about these is that they might have been Greeks, they might have been Philistines, they might have been Sardinians, they might have been from Sicily, they could have been from Spain for all we know. But all that is known about them is that they terrorized pretty much every single major empire at the time. And this is a representation of what one of their ships would have looked like based on the depictions that you see in Egyptian art of the period. Egyptian chroniclers also record that pretty much all of the Sea Peoples carried horned helmets. So that is one of the pieces of evidence that was suggested to support the idea that they were from Sardinia or from Sicily, because both of those cultures at the time were known to have horned helmets. And the most common name that was given to these as a people group was the name Shurden, but it's not entirely sure as to which particular part of the world the word Shurden was supposed to refer to. These people, so when we say they terrorized the Levant, it doesn't just mean that they terrorized, it means they sacked entire empires. So around 1190, they sacked and burned the capital of the Hittite Empire and killed the king, which led to the complete collapse of the Hittite Empire. As of the Sea Peoples, the Hittite Empire no longer existed. They sacked a whole bunch of Mycenaean cities, and very shortly after, the Mycenaean Empire collapsed as well. They sacked pretty much everything that was in Anatolia, Greece, and the Middle East that they could get their hands on. And it is suspected that these would have been one of the major causes for civilization collapse at the time, and we'll get to that in just a few slides. But first, we get to, right around this time, we have the first recorded naval battles. The first one is really just mentioned in a couple of sentences on the epitaph of King Supilima. He sent a fleet to fight another fleet from Cyrus and burn their ships at sea. Pretty brutal. And in 1175, we get to the first battle where the tactics were recorded. This was the Battle of the Delta, and this was when Egypt finally gathered its forces together and defeated the fleet of the Sea Peoples for the first time after they'd been raiding Egypt and many other nations for over the course of several decades, if not over a century. And the way that they defeated them was Pharaoh Ramses, he had a fleet, but he knew that his fleet is significantly smaller than the fleet of the Sea Peoples, so he sent it out to sea, drew them in, and then used his fleet as bait to draw them into the Nile River Delta, where they were then attacked basically by hordes of Egyptian archers. And once they were attacked by hordes of Egyptian archers and the Sea Peoples were confused and sort of panicking, he sent his ships back to overturn them, so presumably ram and then sink them right there and then. So after this, he had to regroup and again get his army over to a different position where he defeated the land army of the Sea Peoples, which was invading separately from the Navy. So these pirates from the Mediterranean managed to have an empire and an army and a navy that pretty much could beat almost every other empire at the time. It was really almost a miracle that Ramses III got this to work, because they destroyed even the Hittites and the Mycenaeans. And unfortunately, for the Egyptians, even though they defeated the Sea Peoples in those battles, they couldn't save themselves from the Bronze Age collapse. So at the end of the Bronze Age, we see this really disturbing pattern of the collapse of pretty much every single major Eastern Mediterranean civilization. And the collapse, all of the collapses happened between around 1250 and 1000 BC, but most of them seem to have happened in just a 50-year period around 1150. And in these collapses, we see the end of the Mycenaean Empire, the Babylonian Empire, the Hittite Empire, the Egyptian Empire, and all of the Canaanite kingdoms which were allied together with Egypt or the Hittites at the time. Pretty much every single major city in the area shows evidence of destruction or abandonment. So places like Hattusa, which were burned by the Sea Peoples, or places like various cities in Greece, which literally just show people up and left pretty much everything that they had there for some reason or other. Maybe they were teleported, who knows, aliens. But really, the only empires that survived this initial onslaught of destruction were the Assyrians and the Elamites. And Elam itself was then destroyed by the Babylonians, who briefly recovered, and then these were brought down by the Assyrians. So everybody was killing each other, and everybody was dying, and historians have been very confused about this. So the most likely cause is right around this time there would have been something called an ice sheet bond event, which would cause the aridification of the world. So you have a significantly lower amount of moisture in the air in general, and if you have a lower amount of moisture, you have less rain gives you less crops, and less crops gives you less food. So a similar event around 2200 BC resulted in the collapses of the Akkadian Empire, the Egyptian Old Kingdom, the Indus Valley Civilization, and the Liangzhu culture in China. So what most likely happens is, as you have the aridification of the entire globe, you have local droughts in areas that used to be more or less fertile. As you have local droughts, people who still want food start looking around at who has food, and if somebody has food, then they go and try to take it by force. Hence, you have war between every single empire against every single empire, because everybody's running out of food, but everybody thinks that the other guy must have food. So another theory for the Bronze Age collapse was that right around this time we would have had the first introduction of iron weapons, and iron weapons would have been significantly cheaper to produce than bronze weapons, and they would have been more plentiful. So while earlier empires had armies that were heavily based on nobles who could afford their own bronze weapons, now you could just send masses of infantry armed with iron weapons that the bronze-wielding nobility would have been powerless to stop. So that could have been another additional impact factor. By 950 BC, so around 200 years after the major period of collapse, we see new kingdoms and empires begin to recover or reform. Most notably the Assyrians, but also the Arameans, the Lydians, the Urartu up in Armenia, the Persians and the Medes and the Parthians recovering modern-day Iran and Iraq, the Babylonians and the Phoenicians recovering to a certain extent, and so on and so forth. Out of these, the most interesting one to look at in terms of military capabilities were the Assyrians, or specifically the Neo-Assyrian Empire, as is the name of the empire after the Bronze Age collapse. This was the first empire that established and maintained a system of roads, primarily to help speed military campaigns, because they covered a very large swath of territory, and they were continuously dealing with rebellions and revolutions in various cities that no longer wanted to be under their rule. So establishing a system of roads made sure that they can transport their army from one city to another and put down rebellions quickly before they can spread and turn into full-out civil wars. They were also the first army to domesticate and use camels for transportation instead of just horses. And the advantage of camels is they can carry a heavier load compared with a horse. They have lower food and water requirements, and they're built for desert warfare, or desert life in general. So if you're transferring a whole bunch of supplies for a large army across the desert, a camel is going to be a significantly better tool to use. They were also the first to incorporate metal into their wheels. All of the earlier wheels, whether based on just a solid block of wood or made with spokes, were completely wooden. And the Assyrians first initially started by putting metal bands around wooden wheels, and eventually went to a few completely metal wheels, although these were fairly rare and presumably would have been used in ceremonial chariots for the emperor, and not much more else than that, just primarily because of the cost and complexity of construction. They had improved river crossing techniques, so here we see the Assyrian army crossing a river. The soldier is clutching an inflated bag. These were basically cow and pig skins that they inflated by mouth, grabbed onto, and then swam across the river with. We see a chariot being transported through in a coracle. This is basically a gigantic basket which has been tarred from the outside, and you can make it large enough to carry a chariot or maybe even a horse on it if necessary. The Assyrians were the first army to equip their infantry with all iron weapons and equipment instead of some combination of iron and bronze. So they had spears and lances with iron spearheads, they had swords, they had daggers, they had javelins, bows and arrows, helmets and shields, which would have had a thin covering of iron around the boss and major other parts of the shield. They were the first to incorporate significantly heavier types of chariots. Whereas earlier chariots usually had a team of 2 horses, or at most 3, these guys had chariots which were pulled by up to 4 horses, and then crewed by 4 soldiers, of which only 1 had to be the driver, and 3 could be doing actual combat. And these might have been, or these could have been used as the first shock chariots to actually smash infantry formations rather than attack them from the sides, because earlier chariots were much too light, and infantry could easily withstand their assault. But if you see a whole bunch of these coming at you, then infantry of the enemy would have had a significantly higher chance of freaking out and then trying to run away and then getting routed in the end. They were also the first empire to have any sort of standard field cavalry. This was initially developed in response to nomadic raiders from the steppes, essentially the prototype Huns and Mongols who ravaged so many people down the line. And what the nomads would do was they would just ride in with a horse, shoot people up with bows and arrows, take whatever they could carry, and then run off. And the Assyrians were not happy about that. So they established the first cavalry corps in history. And at the time, there were no spurs, no saddles, no stirrups, pretty much nothing except for reins and maybe at best like a little cloth that you put onto the horse. So controlling a horse like this would have been significantly more difficult, so what they did was they deployed these in pairs, where one rider would control the reins of his horse and the horse next to him, and the other rider would be completely focused on shooting his bow and arrow at whatever it is that's around him. So you have the benefit of having a rider and a soldier just like in a chariot, but unlike a chariot, this is significantly faster and more maneuverable, so you could actually catch up to those nomadic raiders. Later on, around 750 BC, we have the first cavalry depictions of being deployed with lances, but these are still sent in pairs, even though each man in this case appears to be controlling his own horse, because when you're using a lance, you don't really need to focus on shooting it, you're just holding it and hoping to stab someone at full speed. And the saddle cloths that I mentioned earlier, they appear to be introduced around 700 BC, so you didn't really get to modern horse riding equipment until significantly later in history. In siegecraft, the Assyrians were beyond compare to, or at least compared to everybody who came before them. These had the first mobile battering rams. Essentially, this would have been a covered wooden structure on wheels with a ram at the front, primarily to chip and chisel away against mud brick walls and wooden gates. In addition to rams, they had the first siege towers, which appear in Assyrian art around 860 BC. These would have been armed with a battering ram, and according to these depictions, it's a little bit to the side, so one of the theories was that this could have been a battering ram that would have been raised and then allowed to drop at some oblique angle. That way you could use gravity instead of having to just use a whole bunch of manpower pushing it back and forth. This is also shown as having a very high set nest for archers, so they could engage defenders and pick them off as they are trying to fight back against the besieging army. These were described as being covered in wet skins, so as the siege tower would approach an enemy city, the most logical defense to try against it would be to shoot it with incendiary arrows, so the entire wooden structure goes up in flames. So you take skins and you cover your entire structure with wet skins, and basically they put out the fire of the arrows and your siege tower is saved. And there are also reports, but unfortunately no depictions, of them taking gigantic rafts and putting siege towers on those and attacking enemy cities from the water. Around this time, we also have some further naval developments elsewhere in the world. Most early vessels, like this Mycenaean galley, were just single decked and had a single back of oars. By 800 BC, we have the appearance of the first bireme. So bireme doesn't necessarily mean 2 decks, it just means that there are 2 banks of oars or 2 banks of oarsmen on each side of the ship. In this case, we see a Phoenician bireme that could have been built around 700 BC, in which case both of the banks of oars and both of the banks of oarsmen are on the exact same level. But what it does is, in the pretty much exact same package, you have now twice as much power for your ship. And what that means is that now your ship is able to go significantly faster than it could before and have a lot more power on a strike. The bireme introduced a second upper deck for soldiers because there's absolutely no space on the lower deck now to have soldiers do anything useful. So in order to make sure that you still keep up some amount of compatibility, you put up an upper deck. And the other advantage that this upper deck gives you is that you can now shoot bows and arrows and throw javelins from above at enemy ships which only have just a single deck. This also introduces the bronze sheath ram that is underwater. So while with the Egyptians we saw something that might have been intended to be used as a ram that was an above water structure, this is the first depiction and the first ships that had the underwater ram, so would have been significantly more effective. And it's possible that it was this ram that motivated development of the bireme in the first place, because if you want to have significantly more striking power against another ship as you are trying to break through its side, you're going to be able to have a lot more of that power if you put twice as many people, but the rest of your ship is basically the exact same weight as before. And estimated dimensions for these would have been around 30 meters in length and 5 meters in beam. Not particularly large. By around 700 BC, the Greeks took the bireme idea and improved on it. Now the rowers were stacked on individual levels, and the rowers were completely protected by a side of wood. Therefore, it was impossible for enemy archers to just pick them off, whereas with the Phoenician bireme, the rowers are pretty much out in the open, so if anybody throws javelins or arrows or anything else, they're pretty much dead right away. One of the other things that this allowed the Greeks to do is to make the galley a little bit more seaworthy, because now you had a significantly higher freeboard and less chance of getting the ship completely flooded in during bad weather. And by 540 BC, you finally get to the famous trireme, developed by the Greeks. This is a modern replica called the Olympias. These would have, just like other galleys, these would have used sails for the long voyages and oars really only in case you were experiencing doldrums or if you were in battle. You were not supposed to be using oar power for your entire voyage, otherwise your entire rower crew would just die. Because there is a significant amount of energy that you need to exert to propel a 10-meter long oar over and over and over again through the water. With the triremes, the way that they set the third person is the first two were still on the first and second deck, but the third people were on a third deck that was set out from the side of the trireme. That was called an outrigger. In principle, this decreased the stability on the water a little bit more, but it allowed all of the rowers to remain seated instead of having to stand up for every single push. So that made the movement of the galley a little bit smoother, and it made the propulsion a little bit easier for the rowers. In further centuries, as we get to larger galleys, on those the rowers had to actually get up and then throw themselves back onto the bench with every single stroke. So there required significantly more energy and significantly more effort from each rower. With the trireme, we have about 25 to 30 oars per bank for a total of 170 oarsmen, and it's a little bit longer, of around 37 meters in length, and again around 5.5 meters in width, displacement 70 tons for this particular replica. Also, the ship would have carried about 20 men for deck crew, just to take care of the sails, handle all of the needs of the ship in terms of steering, and it would have also carried probably a crew of about 10 to 15 marines who could be armed with swords, lances, javelins, spears, or arrows. One of the major improvements that the Greeks had on their triremes was improved rams. Earlier rams, their structure was fairly simplistic, just a cone. The Greeks made their rams of significantly more complicated shape. This is the front of the ram, this is the back of the ram. On the back, this would have been fitted into a timber that was specially shaped to fit perfectly to this bronze sheath. And on the front, you see this pattern of 3 grooves that stand out. This is basically to increase contact pressure on impact so that you have a higher chance of breaking through the enemy ship wall rather than just glancing off or bouncing off. This particular one was found off the coast of Israel and has been dated to around 400 BC. Now we also get to the Achaemenid Persian Empire, or as most people in America and the West know it as just the Persian Empire. There were quite a few other Persian empires, but they're sort of glanced over in high school history. Around 480 BC, these were at their greatest extent, at which time they controlled 8 million square kilometers and possibly controlled up to almost 50% of the global population. But these numbers are extremely, extremely approximate. These had a very, very organized army indeed, compared to most other earlier empires. They had two groups of infantry which were supposed to work together, the Sparbara and the Vajabara. The Sparbara were these heavy infantry that you see in the front, armed with a significantly larger shield than most earlier shields that you see, that covered the entire person and then some. And they also had spears to fend off attackers against the shield wall. This was derived from a Syrian formation, but the Syrian formation used smaller shields and a significantly smaller ratio of archers to shield and spearmen. And behind the Sparbara, you would have had a large number, possibly up to 6 Vajabara, which were basically archers who would shoot at the enemy on parabolic trajectories and essentially try to destroy them with just the sheer volume of arrows that are being fired out. The Persians were one of the first empires to use the recurve bow. So the recurve bow is a weapon that has not just a single arc, but it has an arc that recurves a couple of times. That way you get a lot more power for a smaller bow. You can see the recurve shape on this particular one. You also had the Takabara, which were the light infantry. These would have been primarily intended for skirmishing, or basically throwing their javelins at the enemy right before the actual battle begins. So you can try to attempt to disorganize and put disorder into the enemy ranks, and therefore it'll be easier for your heavy infantry to deal with them later. And for close combat, in case they were caught in the middle, they carried battle axes. And finally we get to the immortals, which were the elite heavy infantry, the king's own personal guards. The strength of these were kept at 10,000, so if one of them was killed, another person from the ranks of the rest of the infantry would be taken into his position, hence the name immortals, because they were supposed to be the immortal 10,000. These were the best Persian infantry that was available. They were armed with spears, daggers, bows and arrows, slings, shields, and coats of scale armor underneath a fairly large and usually fairly pretty outer outfit. In addition to their infantry, the Persians still used chariots. These were similar to the Assyrian chariots pulled by 4 horses, but this time with a crew of 3, and typically, once again, armed with bows and spears. The crews and horses both use scale armor in this case, not over the entire crew or over the entire horse, but still an improvement over the completely unprotected horse in earlier times. And in the later Persian Empire, they started mounting scythes onto the wheels of their chariots, which were supposed to slash into enemy infantry formations. And if anybody saw Spartacus, that was supposed to be very effective. In addition to chariots, they also had horse cavalry, which was divided into light cavalry, which would have been used for skirmish duties. And these would have also been armed either with javelins or with battle axes. And they had heavy cavalry, which had a certain amount of armor on the horse and very heavy armor on the rider, or at least compared to the skirmishers. The heavy cavalry would have been primarily armed with lances, and they would have been used to flank enemy formation. So if you break up an enemy infantry formation, the flank is usually very sensitive. So if you attack it with heavy cavalry, it's pretty much going to rout the enemy right away. These are believed to be the precursors to the later cataphracts, which had both the horse and the rider completely in full armor. We'll get to those in the next lecture. And their equipment, other than that, would have been fairly similar to the immortals. So basically, these would have been the cavalry immortals. And in addition to that, they also had the camel cavalry, which was presumably drawn from various peoples that they conquered instead of the Persian lines themselves, because these were introduced into Persian ranks fairly late during the imperial time, around 550 BC. And most of the time, their depictions is that they were light range units, so mostly armed with bows and intended to fight the enemy off from a fairly large standoff, because you cannot do a gigantic cavalry charge on camels. It just won't do. And finally, war elephants. War elephants were developed in India, presumably around 800 to 600 BC, although the early records mostly mention elephants as transporting goods rather than actually going into battle. They were introduced into Persian ranks around 520 BC, after Persia conquered the Indus Valley, and it's most likely that these elephants were crewed by Indian crews themselves. So at the Battle of Gaugamela, the elephants are mentioned to be crewed by people from India directly, rather than Persian crews. And this was actually fairly common because a lot of the Persian army was made up of, in addition to the standard infantry that we saw that the Persians themselves deployed, they used a very large number of troops from countries that they conquered, which they allowed to stay in their own formation. So they would have Median archers, Lydian spearmen, other local slingers, and so on and so forth. So their army was built up of essentially every single hodgepodge that Persia had conquered over the time that it existed. The navy of the Persians wasn't particularly glamorous. It was mostly pulled from various coastal civilizations because the Persians themselves had next to no naval experience whatsoever. They were very heavily dependent on the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians used to be the greatest trading and the greatest naval empire for a certain amount of time after the Minoans collapsed, but they were mostly focused on trade rather than military duties. And as the Persian Empire expanded, it began to develop its own shipbuilding and had a large naval force, but it still depended on these coastal civilizations to both for improved designs of ships as well as most of the crews for the ships. The big major innovation that they did have was pontoon bridges, which were essentially stacking thousands and thousands of boats in a line, putting boards across them, and then transporting whatever army you need across that. So they used that to cross rivers like the Tigris and the Danube, and entire straits like the Bosphorus and the Hellespont. So for the Bosphorus, their pontoon bridge would have had to be over 2 kilometers in length, and they successfully got a fairly large army into Greece across that pontoon bridge, so it was fairly sturdy, because they got over 200,000 men over the course of that bridge's standing. And incidentally, talking about Greece, we get to classical Greek army developments. We have the heavy infantry, the hoplites. These were very heavily armored compared to the Persian immortals. They had a bronze panoply, which was sort of similar to the Mycenaeans, but more optimized for battle. It had a cuirass, which was made typically out of bronze, and later this was replaced by the linothorax, where you had a very thick padding of linen that was then interweaved with other materials to make it fairly impermeable to arrows and fairly difficult to slash through, and that really made it good enough for body armor back in the day. You had a helmet, which evolved over time. The initial helmets covered the ears, which gave you really good protection, but also meant you couldn't hear anything. So later helmets that the hoplites use, you see that there's a cutout over the ears so that you could actually figure out what's going on with your formation. And you had usually greaves on the feet to protect the legs, because the shield would only protect the body from the neck up to the knees, so everything below the knees was protected by the greaves. They also had the hoplon, or sometimes called the aspis. That was their primary wooden shield. It weighed around 8 kilograms, and it had a wood base, and then some bronze and leather on the outside, but primarily built out of wood. It had a argive grip and forearm support, so the argive grip you can see right here is close to the edge. The forearm support would have been close to the other side, and the shape of the shield was curved so that you could rest it on your shoulder and didn't have to carry the entire weight just with your arm itself. They also had the Xiphos short sword. It was around 1.5 kilograms, and with a blade length of between 45 to 60, this would have been very useful in close combat once you lost your spear. But the primary weapon that you were not supposed to lose until you were in close combat was the dory spear. This weighed around 2 to 3 kilograms, had a length of around 3 meters, and it had an iron spearhead. These were supposed to be used by the phalanx of the hoplites as they were in formation, so that the enemy was presented with a wall of shields with another wall of spears in between the shields. The phalanx formation is first seen in around 640 BC on this illustration from the Chigi vase. Here you see 2 phalanxes fighting each other, and then 1 phalanx rushing to the battle, and then soldiers getting dressed up, so putting on their helmet and putting on their greaves. Usually these would have been stacked very close together so that the shields in fact overlapped a little bit, and the phalanx itself would have been several ranks deep. Most of the time it was around 8 to 10, maybe 15. Later on a couple of experiments were held with 25 ranks, but this was fairly rare in early Greece. And these soldiers were rigorously trained to maintain formation, so unlike an army of previous times, they weren't just gathered up from their fields, given weapons and said go fight. These actually had extensive training even during peacetime, but not 100% full-time, because these people still needed to tend to their fields in off hours and off days. So we do not yet see a truly full professional army, which is just 100% soldiering for several years of life. We also see, in addition to the heavy hoplites, we see support light infantry, like the akonistai, the javelin troops. These would have been just using javelins to throw at the enemy and then running away. The lithomaloi, which translates as stone throwers. I guess they would just throw boulders and then run away. Slingers. The sling was actually a fairly important weapon even through the Persian times. because a good slinger could pretty much take a person without head protection out, and a lot of the people who the Persians fought either had very poor helmets or just no helmets at all. So slings were still very much a valid weapon, and sometimes the Greek armies were accompanied by archers, but these were usually pretty rare in classical Greece. Also, the Greeks had cavalry, which they called the pipes. These were usually wealthy noblemen who had their own personal horses, but these were not particularly important in battle until the Peloponnesian War. Early on, they were either using horses mostly just as mounts for the commander, or sometimes a small group of horses for, I guess, moral support, for the most part. So, now we know what the Greeks and the Persians had, we get to the Greco-Persian Wars. We have this gigantic Persian Empire invading Greece. Greece is that little blob of green on the left, in case you can't see it. So, what chance could Greece possibly have against this? Especially considering that Greece itself was fragmented, every single city-state was trying to pull everything in its own direction, and they were continuously fighting, so clearly there's no way that Greece could possibly win anything. But they did. We have quite a few famous battles from the Greco-Persian Wars, but of them, one of the most famous battles would have been the Battle of Marathon, after which we call the word marathon for the race. In this battle, the Persians decided to attack Athens. So they deployed their army several miles south of Athens, and they waited for the Greeks to engage. When the Greek army came out to engage, they packed all of their cavalry and sent it to raid the city of Athens, because now the city of Athens had no soldiers. So what the Greeks did was they realized that the ships that the Persians just sent, they're not going to get to Athens right away because they had to cross a fairly large archipelago. So the Greeks charged the Persians, destroyed the Persians, and then made it back to Athens in time for the ships, which was pretty impressive. And in this particular battle, what basically happened was the Greek formation of hoplites got to around maybe 100 meters of the Persian lines, basically within a bow shot. And then in their full equipment, which was like 30 kilograms of body armor, 10 kilogram shield, maybe like another 10 kilograms for all the weapons, they sprinted in formation against the Persians while the Persians were shooting volleys of arrows at them. Because if they didn't sprint, they wouldn't survive the volley of arrows. And then after they sprinted, they smashed the Persians so hard that the Persians tried to run away into the sea and drowned. Well, unless they were killed by the Greeks themselves. One of the other very important battles was the Battle of Salamis in 480 BC. This is, in fact, considered by some historians to be the largest naval battle in history by the number of people involved. Because in this battle, the Greeks had the joint navy of Athens and pretty much every single major city that Greece had, fighting against the bulk of the Persian navy. So the Greeks most likely at the time had around 300 war galleys, of which 170 were from Athens and the rest from other city-states in Greece. And the Persian fleet was described, or at least most likely had 500 war galleys, 200 light support galleys, and 100 auxiliary ships, which basically includes transports and support vessels. So the Persians might have had upwards of 1,000 according to some writers, and some ancient Greek writers mention even 1,500, but these are probably overestimates, so 500, 200, and 100 for the Persian number of ships is the most likely current evaluation. So what happened in this battle was the Persian fleet decided to trap the Greeks at the Straits of Salamis, and the Greeks followed through with that and didn't charge them. So after the Persians got tired of waiting, they went into the strait and decided to attack the Greeks. And the Greeks used the advantage of, first of all, there was not nearly enough space to keep the Persian fleet organized. So by the time they reached the Persian lines, their entire navy was basically in complete disorder. So when the Greeks charged, first of all, the Persians had very little sea experience. So it was very easy for the Greek ships to just ram in and then come out and then keep on ramming ship after ship after ship. Second of all, the Persians couldn't really swim. So most of the Persians who were on these ships, if the ships didn't make it home, they literally drowned because they did not know how to swim at all. And that doesn't even include the fact that they were supposed to wear some sort of body protection. So in this case, the admiral of the Persian fleet was on one of the first ships, so he was killed one of the first as well. And after he died, pretty much the entire Persian fleet went up in flames because nobody knew what to do. One of the Persian allies, in this case, actually turned against the fleet of Darius and started sinking Persian ships because she figured that an alliance with the Greeks would be significantly better because they were so much better at fighting at sea. But Darius, who was observing this from, or Xerxes, who was observing this from a tall mountain, I believe, up here, he didn't realize that it was her ships that were sinking his ships. So he was observing her and like, oh man, she's so brave, she's sinking so many ships, but they were actually his own ships. So that is a little bit of humor for a day that the Persians lose like 400 ships. If you include that's about 200 people per ship, that's like 80,000 men right there, down into the depths of the sea. And finally, to the big victories that the Greeks won against the Persians, you have the Battle of Plataea and the Battle of Mycale on land and at sea. Both of these happened in the exact same month of August 479, and the Battle of Plataea was actually the largest by manpower battle of the Greco-Persian Wars, and the Battle of Mycale was one of the largest naval battles. Both of these are kind of ignored by the Greeks themselves even, because they weren't quite as loud, but these were the battles that finally pushed the Persians out of Greece proper, and the Persians after this never really made an attempt to get any other armies back into Greece. Also at the Battle of Plataea, you have the oldest record of using poison gas for anything. The Spartans took up a whole bunch of sulfur and then set it on fire right in front of the gates of Plataea to smoke out the Persian defenders, and once they were smoked out, they just charged in because the wall was unprotected. So after the Greeks drive out the Persians, they go back to bickering as they usually do. So we have the Peloponnesian War. The Athens in 477, while they were fighting the Persians, and right afterwards, they founded something called the Delian League, which was basically an empire with Athens at the front, and then most other Greek cities paying tribute to Athens to protect them on sea against the Persian Empire, because the Persian Empire was still right on the border. And everybody was really happy with that for a few years, because they said, oh man, Athens did such a great job at Salamis, they helped us sink the Persians, they're going to keep us safe. But after a while, people got tired and they forgot that the Persians were there, and they said, oh man, Athens is taxing us with so much tribute, we don't want to pay her, let's go to war. And the war against Athens was led by Sparta, which was the other big city in Greece, and for quite a few centuries, Sparta led her own league, called the Peloponnesian League, of her own set of city-states. So what ended up as a result of this war, Athens was defeated, and fragmented Greece was now under Spartan dominance, and then eventually they got tired of Spartan dominance, and so on and so forth. We'll get to that in the next lecture. But with the Peloponnesian War, we have a couple of primary events as well. We have the Athenian expedition into Sicily, where the entire expeditionary force was lost, and this was the first time that cavalry had any sort of major involvement in Greek warfare, because Syracusan cavalry basically routed and completely slaughtered the Athenian expeditionary force towards the end of that campaign. And the war ended at the Battle of Aegospotami, when Sparta decided to attack the Hellespont. The Hellespont was one of Greece's primary sources of wheat, so the Athenian navy was sent out to defend the Hellespont, and the Spartans predictably sank them because they were waiting in ambush. After this loss, Athens no longer had a navy and didn't really have much of an army either. So if they surrendered, Spartans had their walls torn down, the fleet was eradicated, all of the shipyards burned. These are the remains of one of the Athenian shipyards from back in the day. And you basically had all of Greece under Spartan dominance, even while the Persian Empire was still technically sort of on the board. So that's it for today.